If you watch my channel, you know I like using Prisma, so I thought Prisma deserves its own video. And specifically, we're gonna look at how to use Prisma in Next.js, the latest app router. So how to use Prisma in server components, server actions, but also in middleware, for example, which runs on the edge, as it's called. We'll talk all about what that is, serverless and edge functions. I'll explain what those are. So we'll take a look at all of the Prisma main features, including a typical developer workflow, right? So in development and then going to production, how does that actually work in practice? How do you do migrations, for example? Don't worry if you don't even know what it is. Prisma works with most of the popular databases, so like Postgres, MySQL, SQLite, but also, for example, MongoDB. Now, when I say Prisma, Prisma actually is multiple things, right? So Prisma has an ORM, which is what we will actually use in our code. This is also what will actually create the underlying SQL, for example. So this video is going to be mostly focused on the Prisma ORM. But Prisma as a company also offers Accelerate and Pulse. We'll take a look at those a little bit later. So I highly recommend that you watch the video in full if you're adding a database to your Next.js app. And of course, today's sponsor is actually Prisma. Now, to understand where the Prisma ORM fits in a Next.js context, we have to zoom out a little bit. So in a Next.js app, we have both a client side as well as a server side. And actually, I would say it's a much more server-focused framework than a client-focused framework. Right? So if you're coming from the React feed world, for example, where pretty much everything is client-side, it takes some time to get used to Next.js because the server side carries a lot of weight. But this entire thing is essentially one Next.js app, right? But right now it doesn't have a database. So let's say we create a database somewhere in the world, and we need to access that from our Next.js app. So that's going to be from your server side. We could do it directly, right? So we could technically directly interface with our database. However, in practice, we actually tend to prefer using an ORM like Prisma. It simplifies many things and overall is a better developer experience. So that's where the Prisma ORM fits into the overall architecture. So let's actually walk through a simple practical example and I'll show you all of the main features. Let's say that we have a blog and I just have a homepage right here. Welcome to my blog, and I have a link to the /posts route. Let's actually go there and let me actually show you the URL here as well. So when we go to /posts, the way it works in the app router is that it's going to look for a page that matches that path, right? So here in the app router, you create a folder, so posts that would be part of the posts URL, and then this page is matched with that. So this page is now served here in the browser. And what we have right here is just an H1 as well. I just hard-coded the number 0. And here I have a UL, a list. It's currently empty. Here I would like to display a list of the posts, but I have no posts yet. So let's actually add a database and set up the Prisma ORM so that we can actually create some posts into a database and then read those posts into our app. For this tutorial, I will use SQLite in development and Postgres in production. We're going to use SQLite in development because it just makes things a little bit easier here. But if you want, you can set up a Postgres locally as well with, for example, Docker, and follow along as well. That being said, Prisma has a very handy quick start, which also helps you set up a SQLite database. So we can essentially do anything with our database through Prisma. All right, so then here they talk about setting up a TypeScript project. Now, when you create a Next.js app with create next app, that is already a TypeScript project, right? So we already have TypeScript installed here as well as part of the dependencies. If you take a look here, you can see we have TypeScript here already, right? So this is all just a standard, simple Next.js boilerplate that you get from create next app that we all so often do, right? So we already have this. So if we go down a little bit, what we don't have yet is this Prisma CLI. So we're going to run some commands. I'm opening up my terminal here, and let me actually open up another one. Here, we're going to run some Prisma commands. So what we're going to do is npx Prisma. Now, it's a good idea to keep using the same version for this Prisma command. So we're actually going to install that before we even do any of that. So we're going to say npm install Prisma, and we're going to save it as a dev dependency. It's going to install that. All right, so now we can initialize Prisma. So now we're going to say npx. So basically we want to run Prisma. And what specifically do we want to do? Well, we want to initialize here. And by default, it will assume that you have a Postgres database. We'll take a look at that a bit later. Here, we actually want to start off with a SQLite database. It's just a little bit easier in development. So you can also specify that here. We can say the source of the data source provider is going to be SQLite in our case. Press enter there. Okay, so let's actually see what that gave us. So now I have a Prisma folder here, and here I have a schema.prisma. And so this is essentially where we have all the configuration for Prisma, but also we're going to describe here how our actual database should look like what tables or collections if you're using MongoDB. So we see generate a client here. The Prisma client is what we use to actually work with in our code, as we'll see in a second. And it will also use the types. It will create the actual underlying SQL queries. We'll see that in a second. And then here we have information about our data source. So we said we want to have a SQLite database. Prisma needs to know where that is. It needs a way to connect to that. Well, the URL for that database, well, we put it in an environment variable called database URL. Now, we did not define this environment variable, but what Prisma also did as part of the initialization is create a .env file in case you didn't have it yet. And if you open it up, you can see that Prisma has already added this environment variable for me. Now, it's SQLite, so it's just going to be a file, part of our file system, right? So that's where it put that environment variable. Now, in Next.js, we often use a different convention for environment variables. We use .env.local if you actually have a secret. If you want to use the environment variable as part of .env.local, you cannot just copy and paste it in a different file. It's not going to work like that. Prisma does give an example in their documentation on how to use the .env package to load it from a different file in case you want to do that. All right, so for this tutorial, I'll stick to this. Now, if you store secrets in here, you probably do want to add it to the git ignore file. So in the latest Next.js, it should automatically add .env, but you want to double check that. All right, so here for me, it's grayed out. So if I push to GitHub, it won't be in there. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about that schema. This is where you're going to work with Prisma most of the time. So we already saw the client and this data source. Now we want to describe how our database should look like. So we have tables in the world of SQL. So let's say in an application like this, we want to have a table for all the posts, right? So you would say model post, and you can see it's pretty common. So I get a nice suggestion here from GitHub Copilot, but let me actually write that out. So we want each post to have an ID. So you say ID and then the data type. So it could be an integer, could be a string, right? For example, we can say it should be an integer, and we can tell Prisma, hey, this field is actually going to be the ID. It has some special behavior, it should be unique and things like that. And we can also give it a default value. So you use these @ symbols. We can say by default, it should just auto increment, for example, right? So this is going to be 1, 2, 3 as the ID in your database. This is the simplest one. Now, the downside of this one is that if you use the ID in your application, then your users may kind of figure out information about your application. Right, so if you use it in a URL, for example, they may just change the number 3 with number 4. Right, so it's more likely that they gain insights from how your app is working. There is also UUID, which is more complex, and also a more collision resistant version of that. And let's actually use that. And in that case, it will actually become a string. And let's say each post should also have a title, right? That should just be a string. Now, when I save here, watch what happens. It automatically formats this file for me. This will not work out of the box, right? So to make this work, you want to do two things. You want to go to your extensions, and here I installed the Prisma extension, right? So here I have an extension, Prisma, I installed this. So I think this is a must-have. And the second thing you want to do is you want to format things when you actually save the file. So for me on Mac, it's going to be Command S. That also does not work out of the box. So you need to enable it in settings. So if I say Command Shift P, or on Windows, it's going to be Control Shift P. I want to open up my user settings here, and here I have an entry here for Prisma, right? So square brackets Prisma, and I'm saying here the default formatter should be Prisma. Here I already have editor format on save is true for all my files in VS Code. But if that doesn't work, you may actually also want to try adding it directly to here as well. Okay, but for me it's working, so I'll leave it like this. What else should a post have? Well, probably also actual text and some actual content, right? So here we can say content should also be a string. So these are all strings. We already saw an example of integer, right? An integer is just a number, right? 0, 1, 2, 3 without decimals essentially. We also have booleans here, right? So for example, is this post already published, right? So here we can say boolean, and by default we can say false. Right now, if we create a new post, we have to specify title and content. If you add a default value at default, it's optional. If you want to make sure it's always optional regardless of if it has a default value or not, you can also add a question mark. There are two other fields you also often want to add. So for a post, we probably also want to keep track of when it was updated, right? So here, updated at is going to be some date time. And actually what we can do here, there is a special option for this as well, is at updated. So now Prisma knows whenever there is a relevant change, it should also update this field with the latest time, all right? And then often also we want to keep track of when it was actually created in the first place in the database, right? So here we'll just say the default, and that should just take the time at the moment of creation. So because we annotated these like this, we also do not have to specify any value when we create it. So the actual mandatory values that we should specify are just title and content. So we are writing this from scratch. Now, if you already have a database and you want to use Prisma, you can also introspect, as it's called. So Prisma also allows you to just connect the Prisma ORM to your database, and then it will generate the schema for you from what's already inside the database. Before I show you some more advanced features we can add here as well, let's actually try creating our database. We don't even have a database right now. Remember, the Prisma ORM is not our database. It's just sitting in between our database and our application, right? The ORM helps us interface with our database, but our database right now does not exist. So I'm going to open up my terminal here. And what you often want to do in the beginning stages of a project, and you're quickly prototyping your schema, because in the beginning, you don't really know yet what the actual model should be, right? So here I typed it out because I prepared the video, but in the real world, of course, you don't really know what you're doing in the beginning. Right? Should published, should it be mandatory, or should it be optional? You don't know yet. So in the beginning, a command that you're often going to use is the following. So here, whenever you change the schema in the beginning, you may want to run npx prisma db push. So it will sort of push the changes that you made in your schema to the actual database. Now here we don't have a database yet, so if it's the first time, it will actually create a database for us. So if I press enter here, you can see a bunch of things are happening because it does multiple tasks. If I scroll up here a little bit, you can see it's reading the environment variables. Okay, the first thing it actually does here is create our SQLite database. So where is that database? Well, it's actually right here, right? So a SQLite database is essentially just part of your file system, right? Which makes it very easy to work with. And we don't see any data in here. We'll have a different way with Prisma. And it does some other things as well. So here it also says your database is now in sync with your Prisma schema. So what it actually also did is make sure that in the database, we actually have a table for posts. Okay. And then what it also did here is running generate. So basically what it will do is it will take the post and it will generate a so-called client for us. So if you've ever seen Prisma before, so for example, here in our page, what we are going to do in a second is we're going to do something like Prisma.post.findMany, right? So this is the Prisma client. And right now we haven't instantiated the Prisma client yet, but the Prisma client will be able to give us suggestions here. It will know that we have posts in our database because that client has been generated based on what we have here in the schema. That's what generating means. And to do that, it did need to install one more package, which it automatically did for us, which is if we scroll up here, the Prisma client package, right? So we don't have to install this separately. You could install this yourself manually, but it will also be installed the first time db push. And I just said that it made sure to also create a table for posts in our database. But if I click here, I can't actually see that. So how can I even see what's in my database? Well, Prisma helps you out with that as well. So there's another command we can run here. We can say npx Prisma Studio. So if I press enter here, it will actually open up a UI here that will show what's in the database. So let me close this. So what we see here is that we have one model. This is going to be a table, but it's currently empty, right? So there are no posts here, right? So if I click here, it will say there are no rows in this table, right? Because we haven't created anything yet, but we can already see the columns here, right? So those columns are what we just specified here in the schema, right? So all of this is now a column, right? So we have ID, title, content. So here's where we're going to have all of our posts. And then here in our application on /posts, we would like to show all of the posts in our database. So how about we actually add one post here, just some dummy data here. We'll talk about seeding a database a little in a second, but we can already manually quickly add one here. So we can click on add a record. And remember, these are the only two fields that we actually have to fill out here. All the other ones already have default values or are already taken care of by the Prisma ORM or the database. So what we just have to add here is a title. So we can just say first, and the content, the actual body of that post will be, this is a wonderful. Okay, I'm gonna press save change. And now you can see we have an ID and all the other ones are filled out as well. And actually, I maybe made a mistake here for content. I will fill it out again. This is a wonderful post. I will save this one change. Okay, so now if I refresh, yeah, we have this one row. So we have one post now in our database. How do we actually show that here on the page in our application, right? So the page here, what we have, if we take a look, if I close this and if I open up the page here for /posts, which is this one. Here I just have that h1 and I have that list which is currently empty. So how do we get the post from our database, or just the one post that we have? How do we get that? Right here? And actually, where do we even get data in the latest Next.js app router? Right, so if I go back to this overview one more time, where do we actually even get data? So traditionally, maybe you had an API endpoint perhaps, and then from the client, you would make a fetch call to /API/posts, right? Something like that, right? So in the past on the client, you would do something like use effect, right? And then in here, you would make some API call to your backend. So this is what you would do on the front end. So then on the back end, on your server, you had to make sure you actually exposed an API endpoint like this and make sure to connect it properly, right? So make sure you have to correct URL and wire it up properly. So actually quite cumbersome. But this is what you would do in, for example, a React Vite application. Now we are working in Next.js, and the cool thing is in Next.js, you can fetch data without use effect. You don't even have to create a separate API endpoint. You typically don't do it in the route handler. The place to fetch data or to get data in a Next.js application is actually in the server component. So let me actually add that here. So for what I call the GET request, whether it's with the fetch API or with your ORM, right? We're using the Prisma ORM in this case to get data. This is essentially the place to do it. And actually you can see I already marked this as async, because what I can do here, I can just say await. And then here I want to use my Prisma ORM to find all the posts, right? So we'll talk about all the options you have to actually query data with Prisma, but this is what it will look like to get all of them. And this will give me all the posts in my database. And then I can take those posts and I can just map over them right here. Right, so this is a server component, right? So here I can map over all the posts, and let's actually see what markup we want to render here. So we want to have an li for each one. Okay, li, let me just tab through here, right? Welcome to the age of AI programming. I get a bunch of things here that I don't want, but I will keep the li. And we want to link to each post as well, so we can actually view the content, right? Very standard blog type of setup. So I will actually use the built-in next link component here, and I will actually tab through here very quickly. The link component will actually already render an anchor tag for me, so we don't need this one. And let me actually import this, and I'm missing a parenthesis here. Okay, so here I'm mapping over. Now, when I save here, we're gonna get an error because Prisma, the variable here, is not defined yet. We have not instantiated the Prisma client here. Now, very important, Prisma has some Next.js specific documentation. So for example, they will show you the best practice for instantiating the Prisma client in Next.js. So if you don't do it the way they recommend, you may run into an issue, right? So here they explain, as you save your files, it may create another connection to the database every time you save. So here they have a code snippet that I pretty much always use whenever I use Prisma. I just go to this page. You can just Google something like instantiate Prisma in Next.js and you will find this article. And I just copy this code snippet to instantiate that client, right? So what I like to do is I like to create a separate folder actually. So let's see, I will do it as part of the source here, not as app, not part of the app, but just a source. I will create a lib folder here, and then I like to just create a db.ts file right here. And then here I will just paste that code snippet, right? So here what it's doing is essentially importing the client from that package that was already installed for us. And then it just instantiated right here. So here we have that singleton. We don't really need to understand the exact details of this. Here you can see that we're assigning that here to a variable called Prisma, and that is what we're exporting here. And then here it's actually putting Prisma on the global object. So the next time that this file runs, it's already here on that global object. So it will not instantiate it again, right? So basically making sure that whenever we use Prisma, it's not instantiated over and over again. Right, so now I do need to import this. So now my auto suggestions here should work. Yeah, so here we see a suggestion here from libdb, right? So make sure you import it from the right path. Okay, so now let's actually see what we get. If I save here, all of this should work now. So if I now go back here, we can see I have first post here, right? So I added a border on the top and bottom as well. But you can see now this is a very simple example of how we can interact with our database, right? So pretty cool that we don't need use effect or something like this. We can do it directly in a server component. This will run only on the server. So we're not exposing Prisma here to the client or something like that. This will run only on the server, and the render result of this will be sent to the client. And that's why we can still see a server component in the browser, right? So you don't need to create an API route handler. This is the more idiomatic way of getting data in the Next.js app router. So here I'm using the findMany query. But if we look here, the Prisma ORM also offers find first and findUnique. So one use case for example, findUnique would be the following. when I click on first post, we are going to slash and then the ID of the post, right? That's what we specified here. Here for the link, we have slash posts and then we have the ID of the post. So here we have slash post and then the ID. Now we don't have a page file matching this route yet. So if we want to have the actual content of the post that has this ID, how do we do that? Right, very standard example. But how do you do that in a Next.js app router? So this part of the route can be a different ID, right? So this is a dynamic route as it's called. So it's still sitting in slash posts, right? So here in slash posts, we need to create another folder here. And here I'm using square brackets because it's going to be dynamic. Now I can call it whatever I want, but it makes sense to simply call this ID. And then here we have another page.tsx file, which will be served when the URL matches this route. So then here, if I just copy the entire page component from here, I can just paste this one. And here it's just going to be post singular page. We want to have some different markup, right? So here what I want is the following. I just want to have an H1 with the title of the post and then the actual content of the post, right? So here I will get an error because, well, I need to import the Prisma client, which is still going to be that same Prisma instance. And now I'm still getting all of the posts here. Well, that's not what we want here. We only want to get one post, and it should be the post has the ID that's in the URL. So how do we even get this ID from the URL in Next.js? Well, since we specified to Next.js with square brackets that it's going to be a dynamic URL, there's going to be a dynamic route, we can get it here in props. It's called a param, right? So here we have params. In this case, we only have one param. I will ignore the type for now. So params here will have the ID. So here now we can use another query here. We can say find unique. So here we can say, we can open this up and we can say where the ID is the ID from the URL. That's what we get here. Now what you get from the URL is going to be a string. And my Copilot actually wants to convert this into a number. If we hover this, you can see it should actually be a string. So Copilot was not helping me here, but it does show here that the Prisma ORM is type safe. Right? So if you have the wrong type, you will get a warning. So now I can fix my mistake. And I now have the correct type. So now it should be able to get it from the URL, grab the correct post from the database, and that's what we should be able to display here. So let me actually see. Oh yeah, so now if I save here, you can see we have our post right here, the title, and then the actual body from the post. So what we are rendering here essentially is based on what's in the URL, right? So very often actually you want to put information in the URL. There are many benefits to that, right? So somebody can just copy this, send it over to somebody else. They can just paste that URL, and when they press enter, they will see the exact same. Also, a user can bookmark this, right? The URL will be stored, and then later when they come back, we are rendering the exact same. Now here we are using the ID, and technically it works, but in practice, we do want to have nice looking URLs. So we may actually prefer to put the title in the URL, right? So instead of linking the ID, right? So if I close this, so here on the posts page, here in the actual link here, we are using post.id. It would be nicer to have like the title in there. Now, if I do it like that, if I now click here, you can see we get some strange formatting issue here because first post, the title of that post, it has a space in there. So we would like to have like a dash in between and some other formatting as well. So typically what people do is they create a separate field for that. So if we go to our schema here, so each post not only has a title, but we also want to have a sort of different version of the title that is appropriate for a URL. So that is often called a slug, and that should also be string. It's very similar to the title, but it's going to be more appropriate for a URL. Okay, so I just changed my schema. I want every post to have a slug as well. I just changed the schema for the Prisma ORM, but my actual database, if I refresh here, does not have a slug column here yet. Right, so this post here does not have that yet. Now I changed the schema. I need to update the actual database again. So if I open up my terminal here and I will open up another one, I will keep the studio running. We're going to run the same command as before, right? So here we again have npx prisma db push. If I now press enter here, some of the data may have to be removed in order to make this work. And now when I go back here, and actually I do need to refresh here and go back here, you can see that now I also have all the data is gone, but now I also have Slug as a column. If you don't see that after doing that, by the way, you may need to restart Prisma Studio, right? I find sometimes you have to restart it. That's okay. So sometimes the data will be lost. Let's quickly add it back here. I will say my first post. And now for the actual Slug, what I actually want to use in the URL would be, for example, lowercase with a dash in between. Then the actual content here. Wonderful. Okay, I'm gonna press save changes, and again I do need to do that again for the content. That's okay. Wonderful. Post, press enter, save change. Okay, so now I have repopulated my database. Now if I go to /posts, okay, I refresh here and I still see my post here. Also, sometimes you do have to restart the dev server as well, right? So if you see some weird error, just try restarting. Okay, so here we are still getting all of the data from our database, right? That's what we're doing right here. And now we are still linking based on the title, right? So now we do want to make it that Slug. So if I save here, and now if I click here, you can see we get a pretty URL here. Now, based on the Slug, we now want to render this, right? So now if we go back to that page one more time, here we are getting the params, and here we are still using .id. So it's not going to find a post right now. So here I do need to change this to Slug, right? So ID should become Slug. And actually here in the folder name, I called it ID. So if you want to get anything from the URL, you need to use the name that you gave here, which is still ID. So we also need to change this to Slug. Update imports, yes, okay. I will save here. All right, so now there is one issue with Prisma because we are using findUnique. So you need to query by something that is actually guaranteed to be unique. And if I open up the schema here, the only thing here that will be unique is actually the ID, because we annotated here with @ID, which by definition will be unique. But everything else, we have not specified that it's going to be unique. So technically, the Prisma ORM is telling us, hey, you are using findUnique and you're trying to find a post by Slug, but a Slug is not unique here. So technically, from Prisma's point of view, there could be multiple rows in our database here that have the same Slug. I could create another row here with the same Slug. So therefore, it's not guaranteed to be unique. So you cannot query by findUnique. So here, what you also want to add here is @unique. Which makes sense for a Slug because we don't want to be able to render multiple different posts based on the Slug. We always want to have one post have a unique Slug, right? So now if I save here, I just included @unique here, but when I use the Prisma Client here, I still get a warning here. So the Prisma Client is not immediately updated when you change the schema, right? So when you change the schema, not only do you want to update your actual database, you also want to update the Prisma Client so that it has the correct types and other behavior as well. So that's why we're running this command every time. So now I'm going to run it again, right? Prisma db push will update the actual database, but also the Prisma Client. And sometimes it will lose the data. Okay, so I just pressed yes. So it updated the database and then also generated the Prisma Client. So now if I go back here, you can see the red squiggly is gone. Okay, now if I go to my database here, the data is actually still here this time. If I now refresh here, I may need to restart the dev server. So let me restart here, npm run dev. If I now refresh here, we can see our post back again. Now this looks a little bit better. Now there are many other options we have here. So for example, maybe a combination of these fields should be unique. For example, the title and content together should be unique. And so then you have two @symbols. There is also @map. So this is actually creating camel case columns in our database. If you want a different name for that, snake case, you can map it. So then in our code, we still use a camel case like this, but in the actual database, you will have snake case. And same for the name of the table in your database. Maybe we want to give that a specific name as well. You can use @, and we can also create an index. If you create an index, it can improve the read performance. So if you are often getting data by Slug, for example, and you want that to be as fast as possible, it may help to create an index in case you have a lot of reads, right? Querying by Slug, but not lots of updates. Okay, so those are essentially the very basics. Now here on this page, where we are getting all of the posts from our database, right? So here we have findMany. This is just blindly getting all of the posts, right? So let's actually add one more post here. Here I'm manually adding it here. We'll talk about how to insert data with the Prisma Client in a second. I can say second post. It's going to be second-post. I'll press enter there. And then I save. Now we have two posts. Now if I refresh here, we see two posts. So it just blindly gets all of the data. Now, we can be much more specific, of course. Here with where, we can filter, right? So maybe not get all of them, but only where something is true, right? So maybe what Copilot wants to do here is published where publish is true. That makes sense actually, but they are both false, right? So actually the default value is false. So now we don't see anything, right? So now we're filtering all of them out, right? Or maybe we want to have only the post, well, maybe something about their title. So we can say title and then something specific. Well, they should have a title, okay. But also other things like contains, right? So only the titles that contain first, let's say. And so if I save here, you can see I now only get that one post that has first in the name, right? So you can get very granular here. So we have contains. We also have things like greater than or less than, or maybe the title should end with something, right? So only the ones that actually end with post. If I save here, they are both ending with post. So with where you can filter, so you only get the specific data that you want. Now, what if we want to specify the order in which we want them? So here, after we filtered the data that we want, right? So now we know the set of posts that we want. We can also specify other things about that resulting set of posts. So we can say they should be ordered in a specific way, right? So we can use the created at field and we can say descending, right? So now you can see the order is switched. The way that we're getting the data from our database right now means we're getting all of their data essentially. So also their ID, but also their created at, updated at. If you want to be a little bit more specific, you can also say select. We only want to get their ID, title, and slug, let's say. So if I save here, it still works the same because we are only using title and slug here. This can be useful, for example, if you are actually getting a user from a database. A user may have a password in the database and you don't really want to get the password out of the database. You are only interested in other data that the user has, for example, their email. Right, so then this is very helpful because now we would not get the password out the database. It's a little bit safer, right? But let me do it like this. We have a couple more options here, mostly interesting for pagination, right? So right now we're getting all of them, but maybe we only want one, right? So we can just say take one. If I save here, we only get one. Right? We can even say skip the first one, right? So we're taking one, but we're also skipping the first one. So now I get the other one again. These are mostly interesting for pagination, right? So just as an example, I hard-coded the number 0 here, but I would like to show how many posts I have in my database. Let me actually remove this. So we have 2 posts. I would like to show 2 here. How can I do that? Well, the easiest way here would be to just take posts, it's just a JavaScript variable, and you probably know that it's just an array, and we can do .length on there. Right, so it will show that there are actually 2 here. And this works because we are actually getting all of the posts from our database, right? So we can just do post.length. Now, what if we have thousands of posts? Right? In that case, we don't want to get all of them. Right? In that case, you're going to have pages, right? And you're going to have 10 posts per page. So in that case, you're going to use take and, for example, skip. And so if we are on the second page and each page has 10, well, we want to take 10. But we also want to skip the first 10, right? Something like that. In that case, this query will only give you 10, right? So then we would show 10 here, but we actually have thousands in our database, right? And about pagination, actually, they have a wonderful guide here on the website. So you can do so-called offset pagination, which is what I'm showing you here, but they also have cursor-based pagination, right? So this is a great article. I recommend you check it out. Now here, if I want to show how many posts there are in my database, here we cannot just do post.length, right? Because here we are only getting, well, 10, right? So the query here will give you 10 posts. So if you use this variable, you're just going to get 10, even though there are thousands of posts in our database, but we're just loading them 10 at a time. So in that case, you cannot use post.length. Right, so very commonly you want to get the count. So here we can actually get the count with another query, which is prisma.post, the name of your model. Right, this is all type safe. Here you can see post. If I mistype here, Prisma will warn me. Right? The Prisma client is all based on what you specify in the schema. When you run a command like db push, it will sort of build that into a client, the types. So then if we make a mistake, we get a warning. But we can also use .count and it will give you the total amount of posts in there. I can just use that variable to show how many there are. Right, so now we only have 2, right? So I do need to remove these if I want to see them, right? But now that works as well, right? So when you're getting data, these are essentially the options you have. Let me actually remove them and let's talk about updating data. These are what you call the reads, right? Reading data from your database. Now let's talk about writes to your database, right? So creating new posts, updating them, deleting them, the data mutations, fancy words, right? Basically you have reads, right? Reading data, which is what we're doing here. Also, when I click on the second post here in the other page, we are also reading data from our database based on the slug. Right? This is all reading, and these are essentially the main options that you're going to use. But let's say we just blindly want to get all of them from our database, and I will just use .length. This is what we have. Now let's talk about writing data, actually inserting data into our database. We were doing it manually here in Prisma Studio. How do we do it programmatically with the Prisma Client? So let's actually add a form. Let's actually do it right here in the same page to keep it simple. So I just added this form. If I save here, you will see it on the page here. So we just added a simple form here, just form tag with an input. I gave it a type of text and a name of title, and that's what we see here. And then we have this text area for multiple lines. It's maybe the tag you want to use, and this is for the actual content. And then here I have my button, right? Create post. So if I say third post here, create blog post once again. So if I click on create post here, we would like to insert it into our database, right? So how do we do that? Now, traditionally what you would do perhaps is you would do something like on submit, and then you have a function here, and then again you would do some kind of fetch call to, let's say, API posts. Now in this case it would be a post method, right? And then you would grab the form data and send it as part of the body, right? JSON stringify it and send it as part of the body, right? So it would be something like this, and then on the back end you had to make sure that you were actually exposing an API endpoint, and then you had to make sure that you have the correct URL, right? Actually properly wire that up. It was always a little bit messy to make that work. Luckily, these days in Next.js, there is a better way actually. It's to do it with a so-called server action. So we can remove all of this. Instead of on submit, we can use the action attribute actually. And here we can specify a so-called server action. So if we go back to the overview one more time, we saw that in the Next.js app router, to get data, we can do it in server component. Now to actually update data, creating, updating, and also deleting, the idiomatic way is actually to do it in a server action. So let me actually write that here as well. Right. So your traditional post, put, delete requests, we can do that with a server action, right? We don't need to create an API endpoint and use route handlers. We simply don't use them as often anymore as before. The typical use case for these is actually webhooks, I find. And there are some other use cases for them, but mostly we use server components for getting data and server actions for data mutations, right? So here in this case, we want to create something that would be your traditional post request. So how do we do that here? How do we create a server action? So an action is just a function actually. So a server action is just a function that runs only on the server. I could technically define it here, but since these are pretty important, I actually like to create a separate file for them. So here as well, I will create a separate folder called actions, and here I can create a file actions.ts. Now here I do need to add use server at the top. This will make all the functions in here server actions. And then it's just a normal JavaScript function essentially that I can export from here. So here what we want to do is we want to create a post. So in here we can then use Prisma to actually create a post, right? So I get some nice autocomplete here. Let's see what we get. So this looks about right. So in this time we use prisma.post and now not find. We actually want to create a new one. Most important part here is to specify the actual data, right? So here we actually have data, and then here, well, all of the required fields, right? So all of the fields here that are not optional, that are actually mandatory required, is what we need to specify here, right? So if I actually use autocomplete here, you can see we get it. Since the Prisma client has all of these types, we can see the suggestions here, right? So we can see content, slug, and title are all mandatory. So we have title, and yeah, actually what should the title be? Well, that's whatever is part of this form. So how do we get access to the form data here? Well, if we actually specify that function here, so create post, I need to import it, right? So I'm importing it from that file. And now React and Next.js will make sure that when this form is submitted, the form data is actually sent from the browser to this server action, right? So I get that form data right here actually, right? So here it's going to be of type form data. So then here I can use form data.get, and here I need to get it by the same name that you specify here for name in the form. I'm cheating a little bit here with the types because technically form data.get has a special type here for form data entry value and could also be null. In the real world, you do want to add some salt validation here, which will also get you the correct types here. But let's cheat a little bit here. So we have a title and we also have a slug, which is essentially going to be a derivative of the title. So here what I'm gonna do is just take the title and I'm gonna replace the spaces with a dash and also lowercase everything. And then here we have the content. And these are the only three we need to specify. You can see the red squiggly line is gone now. If I make a mistake, again, I get a warning here, right? So this is all type safe, right? So now if I submit the form, all of the data here should arrive at the server side. And here I'm inserting it here with Prisma. So let's actually see if that works. I'm gonna click on create post. Okay, so now you can see the form gets reset, and now I want to see in my database if that was actually added. So let's actually refresh here, and you can see we have an entry here for the post I just submitted. Without creating a whole API endpoint and wiring that up, I can just do it with a server action. It's essentially just a JavaScript function. It runs only on the server, and so React and Next.js, they sort of automatically generate an API endpoint for me and they wire it up for me. So I think this is actually really innovative. A lot of people talk about server components as the big innovation, but I think these server actions are actually the biggest innovation. So now here, if I refresh, if we take a look, if I refresh here, this code will run again and it will just find all of them again. So if I just refresh here, yeah, we indeed see the third post here. If I click it, you can see it's all working perfectly fine, right? So this was a server action for creating a post. Now you can imagine that we would also want to edit a post, right? So updating in with the Prisma ORM. So we can have something like edit post, and here we would receive again the form. There would be some form, right? And you also need to specify which post you want to change. We could do it by ID or by Slug or something like that. Now for the Prisma code here, it's just the update method here. So we do need to specify which one we want to update. Now here it has to be a string actually. Right, so here would be a string, and then again the actual data, right? Very similar actually. All right, and we could also have one for deleting a post, right? So we need to specify which one by ID or maybe by Slug, and then we can say this post should be deleted, right? Just one line here, right? We're not going to implement it here, but I will leave it like that. These are the main ways of doing writes with the Prisma ORM in the latest Next.js app router. Now, one pretty cool thing I also want to show you here, if I go back to my list of posts here, so here we just saw when I submit this form, if I just do fourth post, number 4, you saw that when I pressed create post, I had to manually refresh to get the latest data, right? So I had to manually refresh so it could run all of this again and actually get the latest ones. Now, there is something else you can do in Next.js, which is here in a server action, for example, you can also call revalidate path. So here, you can essentially say, I want to re-render /post. So when it does that, it should pick up on the new post in the database. And it will actually do that as part of that same request response cycle as when the data actually was sent to the server side. If I now create post, if I just press enter here, you can see I don't even have to manually refresh, but the view is automatically updated for me. I think that's pretty cool as well. So now we've covered reading and writing with the Prisma ORM in the latest Next.js app router. All right, so let me actually close out of all of this here. And let's talk a little bit more about relations or relationships between your models. So here right now we only have posts, but of course, a more realistic example would be that you also have users, for example, right? So here you can simply create another model. So a user also needs an ID. We also want to give them a unique email and their hashed password, let's say. Okay, so right now they are existing independently of each other. But of course, we can imagine that a user can have certain posts and we want to associate them together. So how do you create these relations with Prisma? So there are essentially 3 different relations that you could have. So a very common one is a one-to-many relationship. So a user can have many posts, but every post individually can only belong to one specific user. Now that's a one-to-many relationship here. So we can say a user also has posts. And what is that, a string? No, it's actually, well, an array because it's multiple and not a string or something like that. It's actually posts, right? So it's an array of that. If I save here, you can see there is actually some, well, almost magic, which is that the other part that we need to specify here has automatically been generated for me by Prisma as well. So here for the post, we also need to specify that there is a user that this post is connected to. And we don't want to make it optional actually, so we want to make it mandatory. So here we have user. Now I actually like author more. Let's actually call it author. We can call it author ID. And then here we need to make it author ID as well. Here, this author will not actually become a column in the database. Right? So this is just for Prisma. So the way to read this is that the author ID field references the ID field on the user model, right? So whatever ID is here, that is sort of pointing to this ID, right? So like a foreign key in the world of SQL. So that's a one-to-many relation. So another type of relationship is a many-to-many relationship. So a user may have a lot of posts, an array of posts, but one post may belong to multiple users, right? You can imagine that multiple users can collaborate on one post. So a single post should be associated with multiple different users. So what you could do is we want to have multiple authors associated here. And I don't even need to specify anything else like that. I can actually just leave it like this. And this is an implicit many-to-many relationship. So Prisma behind the scenes will understand what's going on here. And the other option is if you have a one-to-one relationship. A user can only have one post, so not an array, but only one, and one post can only be associated with one other user. So in that case, we can make this unique, the author ID unique, and here we make this optional. So a user can have 0 or 1 post. Right, let's make it post. And a post can only be associated with one unique author ID. Now, in this specific context, I think a one-to-many is more realistic. So a user can have multiple posts, right? So an array of them. And here we can just leave it like this. And I actually do like if the updated ads and created ads are at the bottom. So I will move this up a little bit. The order here doesn't matter. You may actually also prefer putting the relations even higher, but I will leave it like this. All right, so now we have changed our schema, but if we go to our database, if we refresh or just browse around, you won't see that reflected here yet, because remember, we have to update our database. So we can say npx prisma db push, and we'll also update the Prisma Client. Okay, we may lose some data. Okay, let's see what we have. If I now refresh, I may need to restart the Prisma Studio, npx Prisma Studio. Yeah, so now here we have two models here, post and user, and actually we have lost all the data. We'll talk about seeding in a second. So let's quickly add some data manually one last time. So actually let's start with the user here. So we only have to specify a user, let's say john@gmail.com. And John has some hashed password, okay? And John currently has 0 posts, okay? I'm gonna save the change here. So now we have one user. Now if I refresh here, we have one. Now if I go to post here, let's add one post as well. I'll say first post -post for the slug. The content is a wonderful blog post. Okay. Now one last thing now is we need to associate this post with a user, right? So you can see here author and author IDs are expected. I can click actually here and I can pick which user, right? So this is the one that we want. If I press enter here, you can see the author ID gets filled out for me as well. Now we can save the changes. So now we have some data again. Now if I try, all right, so I'm getting an error. So sometimes you may actually need to restart the dev server. I find I'm just restarted the dev server. Now if I refresh, we see our post. Okay, and what are we doing in that page? It's just getting all of the posts actually. Let's see, /post. We just have that one query from before, right? Post at findMany. So just getting all of them. Now that we have a relationship, some of your queries may actually look a little bit different. So here we are still getting all of the posts. So here, all the posts, we still have it right here. But what if I now want to have only the posts of a user, right? So here I could query my user, where email is john@gmail.com. Maybe I only want to display the posts of John. So here, this will give me the user. And actually, we'll get an interesting error here. So it says property user does not exist. So the Prisma client thinks there is no user yet, even though here in the schema, we know that there is a user here. So I'm going to make sure it's properly updated. So I'm going to say db push one more time. Okay, it generated the Prisma client again. And now actually the error is gone. So that looks all right. So we know that a user can have posts, right? So a user here can have posts. But if you query the user like this, it does not automatically include the posts, right? So here, if you do user.post, if we do this, and here I do need to start the dev server again, it will say post is not defined. So here you need to explicitly include the actual relation, you could say. So if I do this, and actually here I can also make it user.post. So now you can see I'm getting only the posts from a particular user, but you need to be explicit about that. Now when I create a new post, let's see how that would work. So here I still have my form and it will still be submitted to that server action. But you can see here we already get a TypeScript issue because now the schema has changed. So when you create a post needs to be connected to a particular user. That's how we have defined things here. Post needs to have some author ID. So here you say author. When you create the post, we need to connect it to some user. So we can say connect This is for writing. And then we can say which user, well, the user with email john@gmail.com. So now if I say second post, create a post, okay, so that all looks good. You can see this one has been created, right? So that's connect, and that's also include here. Here we still have a rest quickly line, by the way, because it's possible that we're not going to get any user from our database, right? So here I actually may want to deal with a if not found case here, or just do optional chaining here. Okay, so let me actually clean up a little bit here. And let's actually start talking about seeding your database, right? So far we've been adding a lot of manual data here initially, but there is a more efficient way of doing that. So it's actually with a seed script. So I'm going to delete all of this data here. And actually I may need to do it in particular order because they are connected. So let me delete this as well. The post first and then the user. All right, so now our database is empty again, but you can imagine during development, you're going to make a lot of mistakes. You're going to change your database. And as we saw, when you update your schema, sometimes you're going to lose the data. So it's very cumbersome if you have to manually add data all the time. So Prisma also helps you out with seeding your database, as it's called. So basically, you're just going to run a script that will just insert a bunch of dummy data, right? So I actually like Googling this article as well because it has some handy things that we can copy. So if you scroll down a little bit here they give you an example of a seed script. I'm going to copy the entire script here. And what you can do is in the Prisma folder, we can create a file called seed.ts. I'm going to paste that right here. Here it's actually instantiating the Prisma client because we're going to run this script by itself, not as part of our Next.js app. It's just going to be a one-off script that we're just going to run by itself. So here we do actually want to instantiate the client. And then here we have the main function, which will actually, well, simply insert. So in the example, they're using upsert, which is essentially just adding, but in case it already exists, you can update it. That's a very straightforward actually. So then here the actual function is called, and after it's done, it will also disconnect, right? But the main function here is the meat of it. And let me actually remove this because we don't want to do this. We want to do something slightly different. So we want to insert some posts. So let's actually create an array with just some dummy data. We can call it initial post, and it's just going to be an array of posts. So let's start off with one post. So each post needs to have, well, a title, well, post one, okay, and a slug, right? Post one, okay, slug, okay. And now, well, what else do we need to specify here? We don't have autocomplete here, no relevant suggestions, because this is not typed here, this array. So is there maybe a way that we can use Prisma here to help us out to type this array? And the answer is yes, actually, because we have essentially described everything about the user and posts here. And in your application, you're often going to need types for your users, for users or posts, right? In your actual project, you're going to have utility functions, you're going to have intermediary functions and places essentially where you need to type something. In React, we're going to have props, for example, you need to type props. Very often, those are going to be very similar to what we have already described here. So it would be kind of duplicative if we had to describe it again in types. We don't have to do that, luckily, because Prisma also gives you types based on your models. And we can use that in our application, right? So those types are coming from the Prisma Client, right? So you're building all of this into Prisma Client, and it has types, and we can actually find those types. So they're in here, and then here under Prisma Client, here if I go to the index file here, I can see there is actually a type for creating a post. Everything that is necessary to create a post, there is actually a type created by Prisma for me. So here I can say this array needs to be whatever that type is, well, it needs to be an array of that. Right, I do need to make that, I do need to import it properly here. So we'll make it Prisma dot, and then I will import Prisma from the client. And now you can see I'm getting type safety here because we're saying this array needs to be of a particular shape, right? So now also I get autocomplete. I know, oh yeah, I need to specify content here as well. Right, so here I'm just using a Prisma type for the seed file, but you can imagine this is very useful throughout your application. Very often you're going to derive types from here because for a certain utility function, this is not the exact type that you need. Maybe you want the title to actually be optional in some instance, so you would slightly modify this to get the specific type you want. But this is a very underrated feature of Prisma as well. Okay, so here, what else do we want to specify here? So here we also have author. So every post needs to be connected to some author, but we don't have a user yet, right? We deleted everything. So here you would do something like connect, right? We want to connect to a user, but we don't have one yet. So there's actually also connect or create. So if there is not one yet, we can actually just create a user here on the spot. So here we can say where the email is again, let's say John, and then we want to create, right? So we're going to create an actual user, which is not only an email. Right? We do need email here. When we do want to specify email here, okay. But a user also needs, well, let's actually use the type of the suggestions here. Well, a user also needs hashed password, right? So let me just put some gibberish here. So this is one post that's going to create a user for us. We can add more posts. Let's actually just stick to one. In the actual main function, I get a good suggestion here. So we start seeding and then we go over each post. Now the actual Prisma query to create a post is the following. You say prisma.post.create. And this is now the correct format because that's how we have typed this, right? So you can see there's no red squiggly lines. So this should work perfectly fine. So now I have my seed script. So I don't have to manually create it over and over again. I can just run this script. Currently our database is empty, so I would like to run this script now. How do I do that? All right, so we want to run this script. Now a lot of people make a mistake here. So this is just a one-off script that we want to run. So we're not going to run this as part of our Next.js app. We actually just need to use TS node actually. And actually that same page has a nice command that we can just copy. So here, this is the command that we want to copy. So actually we want to add a Prisma key to our package.json. So here we can just copy this and just, actually let's do it below the script. So here we can have Prisma script. So here we will say Prisma seed and we're going to use TS node to run a TypeScript file one-off. Now we do need to add compiler options here as well, otherwise you're going to get an issue because we are using the ES module syntax here, and then this is the file that we want to run. Okay, we do need to install tsnode to make that work. So let's install tsnode as a dev dependency, and now to run this, we can say npx prisma db seed. All right, let's see what we get. All right, so that looks pretty good. Now, if I go to my database here, let's see what we have. Okay, so now we have a user. All right, so we have a user and the user has posts, right? One post. Okay, so this is looking pretty good. If I now go to the homepage here or to /post and refresh, we see our one post and here we see the content. All right, so that's a way of seeding your database. A quick note on error handling in Prisma. So here when we submit the form, we are invoking that server action, right? So here I have an action, create a post. Well, actually we have other ones as well for updating and deleting. And here we are using Prisma. Now there are certain things that can go wrong. And in fact, there are actually lots of things that could go wrong. So you probably want to wrap this in a try catch. So here I want to try to create this post in our database. And if something goes wrong, we will get an error will be thrown here. We can catch that and Prisma will structure it in such a way that we can actually learn what the error is. So for example, here we can check if the error is an instance of, let me actually import this, Prisma Client known request error. So Prisma will have certain error codes that we can look up here as well. Right, so they have a bunch of codes here. So for example, this particular one means that there is some unique constraint violation. So here, for example, what we could have in our schema is that the email needs to be unique, right? So that's what we have here for the user. The email needs to be unique. So if a user tries to sign up and we're attempting to insert a user into our database with the same email that already exists, we will get an error here. And because of this error code, we know why it did not succeed, right? So here, for example, we also said that post here, Slug needs to be unique, right? Slug is based on the title. That's how we do it. So here, Slug is based on the title. So if I actually create a post here with the same title, post 1, let's actually see what we get. This is running on the server, so if I want to see the console log, I need to open up my terminal here. So let's actually submit this. Let's see what we get. Okay, so now you can see we caught the error and we can deal with that as we please. Also, a quick note on caching. Caching in Next.js is actually a pretty complex topic, which deserves its own video, but just to give you some pointers here. So now whenever I go here, it's going to make this query to the database, right? So without caching, whenever somebody would go here, we're going to render all of this, reach out to our database and send it back to the user again, right? Which is not really efficient. Ideally, we can do some caching here. So then if the user comes to this page, we don't have to reach out to our database all the way and back again. So Next.js itself offers some caching. So Next.js has a so-called data cache. This is actually a very powerful cache. If you deploy to Vercel, for example, that data cache is also persistent even across deployments. And by default, if you get data with your ORM, it's not enabled, right? So if you want to enable something like that, typically, right? So you may want to consider doing something like this. Here I'm using the cache function. I can import this from Next cache. It won't show it for me here because as of recording, it's still unstable. So I need to import it as unstable cache and then I can rename it. This should store the result in a data cache so that we're not unnecessarily making database calls over and over again, right? So that is the data cache that Next.js offers. Now Next.js has another cache, and in that cache you can add statically generated routes. So for example, the HTML of this page can be generated during the build. So then we already have the HTML, right? So we only have to run this once. We compute the HTML of this page. And then when somebody goes here, well, we can just serve that HTML from a CDN, right? So then whenever somebody comes, we're just going to serve it from a CDN over and over again. So in that case, we also do not have to make a database call over and over again. Now, since I'm using params here, I'm using a dynamic route. This is not statically generated by default. However, Next.js does offer the option to pre-generate. So by default, all the pages in your Next.js app are actually statically generated because that's optimal, right? If we can already compute the HTML during build time, well, we might as well do that. Now this route here though is dynamic, right? So this slug could be anything, could technically be millions of different slugs. So Next.js will not pre-generate the HTML for millions of different possibilities here. So if you have a dynamic route, it will not be static by default. However, we can still pre-generate this ourselves. For example, the top 100 most popular posts, but it's outside the scope of this video. So that's all Next.js. Now Prisma, the company, also offers something called Prisma Accelerate, right? So this will allow you to optimize in many different ways, including caching as well. And so it helps you with connection pooling, but also global caching. So here in the API docs, they show you that you can actually also add a cache strategy to your actual Prisma queries, right? So here I could then also add something like a cache strategy time to live. So during 1 minute, it's going to be served from that cache, right? So that's also something that you may want to take a look at, right? So that's another level of caching that you can add as well. That's something you may want to take a look at. There are still some very powerful features that the Prisma ORM offers, like automatically generated migrations, and it can run in a so-called edge environment. Now to show those things, let me actually try pushing this to production, right? So there are also some production related issues that you need to know about. So this is all development. So this was all development. And here we are using SQLite, right? So SQLite is essentially just a file, part of your file system. Now, if you deploy to a host like Vercel, SQLite is not going to work. Vercel is a so-called serverless host. So what they do essentially, and I'll show you that in the dashboard as well once we deploy, is that they will spin up a bunch of serverless functions to run the necessary compute. So a serverless function is not a long-running server, right? So traditionally you had like maybe even like a dedicated server just running in the background waiting for requests. So that server is running even if you don't have any requests. So it's not really efficient. But with serverless functions, you can run compute as the requests are actually coming in. And when there are no requests, it's not gonna run in the background. So with serverless functions, you do not have a persistent file system. And therefore you cannot use SQLite here on Vercel. And there are other hosts like Terso that actually do offer hosting for SQLite. So Vercel does offer a Postgres option here. So we can use that in production. So I can go to the storage tab here and I can create one database here on the free plan. I can name it something like test, and it's actually using the Neon database under the hood. So let me actually create this. Okay, so I just created a database here on Vercel, and here it shows you for Prisma how to connect to that. So here I do need to change this in my schema now, because now I'm going to connect to a Postgres database, right? So I'm going to remove my SQLite database for now, and I'm just going to connect to my Postgres database right here. Okay. Now it does need these environment variables, so here they give me them. I can copy them, and I'm just gonna connect to our database right here. So here I can go to .env, and here I can paste my environment variables. Okay, so now I'm connecting to my database on Vercel. So this could be my production database. Typically you don't want to connect to your production database during development, but just to keep it a little bit simple here. So now if I go back to my app, if I refresh, we will get an issue because we changed our schema and the Prisma client is not updated yet. So if you try running the Prisma client, it will give you an error. So we do need to update the Prisma client again. So here I can say npx Prisma db push, right? It will not only update the Prisma client, it will actually also update our actual database, right? And this time, that's actually our production database on Vercel. So here you can see our database is now in sync with the Prisma schema. So our database on Vercel, where can I actually see that? Where is the data here? Well, it's also here, data. If I now click here, you can see we have these two tables. That's what I just did here with db push. It connected to my Vercel database, and it also updated the Prisma client. So now if I try going to /posts, I still get an error. Probably I just need to restart the dev server here. So I will restart the dev server, and now if I refresh here, okay, so now you can see we are not getting any posts because the database that we're connecting to right now is empty. Right, it has the tables and the columns, but we don't have any rows. And so now I have this database, so I can delete that SQLite database that we had before, this dev.db. I'm going to delete this for now. And now we have completely moved over to using that Postgres database here on Vercel. Right, so in the real world, what you would want to have is a database for production and then also a separate local database, ideally the same type that you also have in production. Right, so if you have Postgres in production, you ideally also want to have Postgres in local development. Here right now we just have one database just for simplicity, but typically of course you don't want to connect to your production database during development. So let's actually talk a little bit about migrations and a typical development and production workflow. So in the beginning of a project, you don't really know what your schema eventually should be. You're just quickly prototyping. You're trying different things, and so whenever you make a change, right, maybe you're like, post doesn't really need published. Right, so now I changed my Prisma schema, and we know that now we have to update our actual database as well. Right, so we saw what we've done so far is use one command for that, which is npx prisma db push. And this will update our database, so then published will not be a column anymore. Now this way we are not keeping track of the changes that we are making, right? So this does not produce migration files, right? And that's fine with us because we're in the beginning of a project, we're quickly prototyping, and now we're like, oh, okay, yeah, actually it should have published, right? So then I can save here, I can quickly update my database again with this one command. Now over time you have a better idea of what the schema should look like, and this time you actually want to keep track of the changes that you make in your schema. Why do you want to keep track of them? Well, if I'm making changes in my local development database, the exact same changes should also be applied to my production database, right? So I need to keep track of the changes I'm making, so then in production or other environments or other people on my team apply the same changes so that all the databases are in sync, right? So now if I make a change, maybe I'm going to add, let's see what Copilot can come up with for me. Maybe it has an image URL that I want to add now, right? So now I made a change. I'm going to save here, but I want to keep track of this change I just made. So in development, now we're not going to run db push. We're going to say npx prisma migrate. We're going to create a migration, and we have to say this is for development. So if I press enter here, now it will do something similar to db push, but it will actually create an artifact, basically allowing us to keep track of the changes. So then in other environments, we can produce the same change. Okay, so all data will be lost. That's okay because we have a seed script as well. Okay, so we can add a new migration. So the first one, we can just say first. All right, so then you can see this looks very similar as what we had before. Your database is now in sync with schema, generated Prisma Client, but here it also says something about migrations. And actually we can see that here. Now we also have migration here, right? So now here you will get a folder with all of the changes that you're making to your schema, right? So here it's actually a SQL file, and basically SQL that we can now apply, right? So this would be during development. We just made a change to our development database. Now when we push to production, we have a history of the changes we made. So then we can also apply these SQL files, these migrations, to our production database, so that our production database is completely up to date as well, right? So that's how you would continue developing at some point, once you know a little bit better about what the schema should be and you really want to keep track of changes that you're making. And it's really nice that Prisma automatically generates these for you. You can see when you run that migration command, after it also immediately runs the seeding files. So we don't have to do that ourselves. Now, like I just said, we want to make sure that we apply these changes to our production database as well, right? That does not happen automatically. So what we want to do is go to package.json. One thing you could do, you can say when we deploy our app to Vercel, we want to apply these changes to our production database, right? So here what we could do is postinstall. We need to do two things actually, but one of the things we could do is here also run those migration files. So to do that, we say Prisma migrate, and now it's not dev, its deploy, right? So for production, you could say. And there's one other thing you also typically want to add here, according to the Prisma documentation, which is Prisma Generate. So when you deploy to Vercel, Vercel will build our app. Now the Prisma client is in Node modules. We are not pushing that to Vercel. So Vercel does some caching. If we want to get all of the correct types, also when we deploy, we can run this script and it will generate the Prisma client. Right, so this is something you typically want to add to post install. All right, so now let's actually try deploying to Vercel and see if this all works. So I'm quickly going to create a repo here on GitHub, my cool blog. I'm going to make it private, create repository, and then I'm going to push this to GitHub. I will add everything and just commit and push. Okay, so now it's all here. So now here on Vercel, what I can do, I can add a new project, click on import. And now if I deploy, Vercel will grab the repo here from GitHub and it will run a build. Right, so it will install dependencies and then after that it will run that post install script. Okay, so we get an issue and it is an environment variable. Yeah, so here it's trying to connect to the database and we have our environment variables here and we have them on Vercel as well, but you need to connect your project. So here you need to go to your project and then under storage, I can connect here and it will automatically, and Vercel will automatically set the environment variables for me. Okay, now this project is connected. I can just try a redeploy. So here I can go to deployments and just redeploy here. And actually the type checking is very strict. So if you forget to type something, it will fail the build. So let me actually quickly type these params. I will quickly just add that to the repo. Okay, let's try again. All right, so it's succeeded. Let's actually open this up and let's see if we can actually work with this. Okay, view posts. And it actually already seeded our database. So we can see one post here. If I click on this, we can see the content. Okay, let's actually try adding another one, post 2. Task, create a post. Let's see what happens. All right, so now we see post 2. And if I click on this, everything seems to be working. All right, the last thing I want to mention here has to do with serverless and edge function. So if I go to logs here, you can see that as I was browsing around, certain things happened here. So there was some compute here, and you can see that there was a serverless function here that was servicing that request. Right, so we just talked about serverless functions. So there's no long-running server, it's just a function, basically more on demand, and therefore we could not use SQLite, but we can use the Prisma ORM. Now there is an even more advanced type of function, you could say, which is an edge function. So an edge function is even closer to the user. So that would be even faster if we could run the compute on an edge function. Now in Next.js, by default, if you have middleware, so I could also add middleware to my app here. I do it as a direct child of the source here. So here I'm exporting a middleware function. One of the main use cases for middleware is to do authentication. So what you may want to do is actually getting a user from your database. And you want to use the Prisma ORM, Prisma.user, and then we could try to get a user from our database. So this middleware with Next.js is going to run on the edge. Other parts of your app may also run on the edge if you opt into them, right? So for example, I can actually export a constant here. I can say this needs to run on the edge, right? So wherever you add this, the relevant compute for that will also run on the edge. But the middleware by default will run there. Now ORMs, generally speaking, they're pretty sophisticated. So they have some kind of query engine. They need some resources. And these edge functions in the edge environment, those are limited environments. So you have more limited CPU memory. You don't have access to all of the Node.js APIs, right? So it's just a more limited environment. And so ORMs in general actually struggle a little bit with that. So if you do it like this, actually I will get an error here during development even, and it will say Prisma Client is not configured to run in Vercel edge function. So they offer you two options. So traditionally you could use Prisma Accelerate, right? So we saw it before. It can help you with caching. It can help you with performance, but it also helps you run the Prisma Client at the edge, right? So also on Cloudflare, and also helps you with a connection pool. Now, more recently, actually, you can also run the Prisma ORM on the edge if you use a driver adapter. So this is, as of recording, still in preview mode, but they show you here how you can already start using that, right? So to run the Prisma ORM on the edge, we just need to instantiate the Prisma client a little bit differently, right? It's just a couple of lines like that, just some lines like this. So they basically have an adapter here based on the Neon database in our case, because we are deploying to Vercel Postgres, which under the hood is using the Neon database. So it would look something like this. I recommend that you check out the docs for the exact code that you're gonna need, but this will allow you to run Prisma on the edge as well. So we talked a lot about the Prisma as an ORM, but I recommend that you also check out their Accelerate and Pulse products as well. So Pulse is interesting because it will let you know if there is an update in your database. So if you have microservices, for example, there is a new user created in the database, Prisma can send you a notification. You may want to send a welcome email, for example, right? So I would say check it out as well. I had a great time working with Prisma, and I want to thank Prisma for sponsoring this video. I want to thank you for watching this video. Hopefully it was helpful. Good luck with adding a database to your Next.js application. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.